Hello, my name is Anna-Marie Rezk. I'm a final year PhD candidate at the University of Edinburgh. Today I'm presenting our paper titled Agency Aspirations, Understanding Users' Preferences and Perceptions of their Role in Personalised News Curation. But let's rewind a little bit first. Most of us are familiar with personalised media services, and most of us use them regularly. They help us navigate through content that is relevant to us or interesting to us, and overall aligns with our wants and needs. These wants and needs are inferred by signals users give these systems and could range from time spent on a media item to more obvious ones, such as having liked an item. On commercial platforms, such as social media or news aggregators, the underlying goal tends to be maximizing engagement and clicks. But what does this mean for news, for journalism, and for public service media? We know that news outlets are embracing different forms of personalization to cater to the new expectations of the users. The difference to commercial platforms is that news editors cannot solely rely on success matrices, such as clicks, to consider their approaches to personalization meaningful or successful. Editors are guided by normative news values, such as timeliness and impact. This means that they must prioritize public interest over commercial gain, and the way to ensure that news values are upheld is by retaining some editorial control. In algorithmic news recommenders, abbreviated ANRs, we are therefore observing three players interacting in a reciprocal process, which results in recommendations. In this reciprocal process, all three players are continuously informed and being informed by each other. Here, the user behavior plays a pivotal role in influencing recommendations generated by the system or editors, and simultaneously, these recommendations, once presented, further inform the actions and the decisions of the user. However, despite their significant role in personalized news curation, users remain largely unaware of how their behavior may influence their news curation, as well as their overall potential to be active agents in this process. We therefore set out to understand this reciprocal process and how it transforms the roles of the involved parties, specifically the user role, and also how the transformed role of the user can be leveraged in a meaningful way. We therefore ask, how do users perceive their own agency? How can users be empowered to be active agents in their news curation by design? And how can we design systems in which individual users understand themselves as active agents in their personal news cycle and exercise their agency? To answer these questions, we conducted a user study. For this, we built a fictional algorithmic news recommender system called NARES and asked participants to interact with it. The twist is that NARES serves as a provotype, or in other words, a provocative design artefact, aimed to surface tensions in a system and elicit sentiments around it to inform user-centric design. So you may be wondering, what exactly was the provocation behind NARES, and how was this provocation informed? Ahead of developing NARES, we conducted a wider scale interview and survey study to learn about user sentiments surrounding personalized media services they use in everyday life. We found, among other things, that participants vouched for increased transparency and user agency in their use of these systems. So we delivered just that. A news recommender system with unprecedented amounts and forms of agency and transparency, as transparency is needed to exercise agency. So, what does NARES look like? NARES presents itself as a news recommender system, displaying news stories back to back. Users can interact with them in various ways, such as liking, disliking, or skipping them. And their interactions not only inform which stories they are shown next, but they also determine which audience segment, or as we call them, which news personality type, they are assigned to. These types are made up of 4 pairs of binary characteristics describing news consumption. In total, there are 16 of them. Once NARES has collected sufficient data about users, it presents them their news personality type and how it relates to the final personalized newsfeed generated and assigned to the users as a result. So, in terms of transparency, NARES delivers. Then in the follow-up discussion after interacting with NARES, participants have the option of changing their news personality type for whichever reason they want. So in terms of agency, NARS also delivers. What we wanted to learn was how users would react to this amount of agency and also transparency given to them. We asked ourselves if users would want to exercise their newfound agency. Would they associate it with responsibility? And would they want this responsibility? And ultimately, how do they see themselves in the process of the news curation? We conducted a thematic analysis and found the following. As we see, after being given the option to change their news personality types, over half of the participants decided to not change them. So let's actually first look at the reasons for why participants changed their news personality types. One reason was disagreeing with the classification, and then obviously using the opportunity to rectify it. Another reason was aiming for more aspirational characteristics, in the hopes of this resulting in them getting better news. This was, for instance, the case for news personality types with the attribute distracted, where the opposite would be attentive. Participants assumed that by having a news personality type that is considered attentive, they would get more long-form news and be overall more informed. Another reason for wanting to change their news personality type was the desire to see an alternative newsfeed, even though it does not cater to them and is not tailored to them. They wanted to have a more universal experience and see what other people are seeing. And ultimately, being able to change their news personality types made them feel in control of what they are consuming. Reasons for not changing their news personality types were, for instance, agreeing with the classification of the system. Another reason was relying on the system's assessment, as it was a result of their behavior being carefully tracked and analysed, more so than they can do themselves. So they believed that NARS had a more accurate assessment of their news consumption behavior than they would have of themselves. Another reason was refusing to take on the work that they would attribute to a news recommender system, or a recommender system in general. And finally, another reason for not wanting to change their news personality types was that some participants believed that by interfering and rectifying something that's potentially wrong, they would be revealing more to the system about themselves to paint a more accurate picture. A more meta-level understanding of agency was also exhibited by participants who reported that just by them continuing to interact with the system, they were already exercising agency, as this in and of itself was a deliberate choice. But the interaction did not end here. After choosing which news personality type the participants wanted to proceed with, they would then interact with NARS Part 2. NARS Part 2 followed the exact same logic as NARS Part 1, with news stories being displayed back to back. However, here we again have a little twist. If during the interaction of NARS 2, the news personality type that the participants proceeded with, so if they had changed it, the one that they had changed it to, or if they decided to keep their news personality type, the one that they kept, if that type no longer matched their behavior in interacting with NARS Part 2, the system would visibly override their news personality type, in a way breaching the user's idea of their newfound agency that they may have previously held. And in the ethos of keeping everything transparent, they are presented the screen. Another twist to add to that is that for NARS Part 2, participants were randomly assigned to one of two groups, A or B. And depending on the group that they were assigned to, they would get one of two overrides, which are these. So Group A would be told that the algorithm is overriding, and Group B would be told that the rules of the curating editor are overriding. This was done to create tension between the three entities that we've already discussed of the reciprocal process, and to then confront users with this tension even more. This was done in the follow-up interview after NARS Part 2, where participants were then shown the override screen that they did not receive, to reflect more on the dynamic and the tension of these three entities, and ultimately what that meant for the role of the user and their agency. This led to discussions on who should have control or the final say over curation, the user, the editor, or the recommender system. We were particularly interested in where the participants saw themselves. Are they agents or consumers? In our thematic analysis, we found that most of the participants, as you can see in this graph, perceived themselves as agents, some of them as consumers, and some of them were inconclusive about how they perceived themselves. Reasons for participants to view themselves more as consumers were that they trusted the editors or the system's expertise, or believing that it wasn't their own responsibility to curate, but rather to consume. Reasons for perceiving themselves as agents were a want to co-curate and believing that users are also responsible for their news intake. We learned from these studies a few things about users' attitudes towards agency. For a variety of different reasons, there are positive and negative attitudes towards agency. Overall, or on a meta level, agency was understood as an intrinsic trait. Participants also reflected on how they can leverage their agency for a responsible news consumption, that is, by exploring alternative news feeds. Additionally, while agency might not always be exercised and instances where it is provided might not always be used, its presence was always appreciated. That was evident from a lot of participants who decided to not change their news personality types, but were appreciative of the option to do so. Transparency was considered a requirement to exercise agency. It was also considered a trust-enhancing measure. In terms of how aggressively transparent NARES was in some instances, we also learned that it requires balance to avoid overwhelming users and that it made more sense to allow for transparency at the user's discretion. In our paper, we ultimately present a number of design implications for design for agency. We learned that to support the positive attitudes that participants have towards agency, platforms have to focus on introducing or enhancing user-driven personalization and explicit agency. This approach aligns with the observation that users, despite hesitating to exercise agency, valued having the option to do so. Users' aspirations to explore diverse content and viewpoints must be acknowledged as well, as this could present a powerful way to mitigate the concerns of filter bubbles and wider fragmentation of society. We learned that overall, there was a need for universality among the users. Another suggestion we made are providing mechanisms to counteract the potentially limiting effects of personalization, for instance by allowing users to venture beyond their typical recommendations. The same applies to detrimental user behaviors, such as doom scrolling, for which we suggest mechanisms that detect these and redirect users. These redirections should be traceable at the user's discretion. And this ultimately also applies to transparency of how the system profiles and generates recommendations. The inner workings of such systems must be made transparent enough to empower agency in users, but not too overwhelming or openly presented at all times. Transparency is understood as a trust-enhancing factor, which is why balancing the right amount of it can result in users being more comfortable to share their preferences when they know how the system will use them. To conclude, in this work we set out to learn about user agency and personalized news curation to ultimately support the creation of systems in which users can exercise their agency and understand themselves as agents. We believe that user agency is oftentimes overlooked, even though it has mutually beneficial potentials which can be leveraged with appropriate design measures. Thank you.